name is Rachel Angel, and I'm a bookseller at Malaprop's Bookstore and Cafe here in Asheville, North Carolina. And we're looking forward to tonight's conversation with Allyson, McCabe, and Kimberly Mack. Bringing authors and readers together is central to who we are as an independent bookstore, and we couldn't do it without you and your support. So thank you for purchasing books and gift cards from us, for attending our events, and for being part of a wonderful community of book lovers. We encourage you to ask questions this evening, and you have two options. Log into YouTube if you haven't already, and type your question starting with a Q to help distinguish questions from other comments. Or you can email your questions to virtualqa@malaprops.com. My colleague Patricia is also posting the Q&A instructions in chat, and will post links to purchase the books in the chat. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the authors we'll be hearing from this evening. First up, we have Allyson McCabe. Allyson McCabe is a writer, reporter, and producer whose work is often broadcast on NPR, and her byline appears in the New York Times, BBC Culture, Wired, and other publications. Tonight, we'll be discussing her new book, Why Sinéad O'Connor Matters, a stirring defense of Sinéad O'Connor's music and activism, and an indictment of the culture that canceled her. And secondly, we have Kimberly Mack, an associate professor of English at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, a music critic and a memoirist. She is the author of Living Coulour's Time's Up, Bloomsbury, Fictional Blues, Narrative Self-Invention from Bessie Smith to Jack White, which won the 2021 College English Association of Ohio's Nancy Dasher Award. Her book, Living Coulour's Time's Up, is about iconic Black rock band Living Coulour's 1990 release Time's Up, which was recorded in the aftermath of the spectacular critical and commercial success of their debut record, Vivid. Welcome. And thanks for being here tonight.
So hi, thank you, Rachel, and thank you to Malaprops, and thank you to you who are joining us this evening. As Rachel mentioned, I'm a journalist, and my work is often broadcast on NPR. And the kinds of stories that most interest me are stories about figures who have been overlooked or forgotten or seen through a distorted lens, or maybe never seen at all. And how I came to Sinéad O'Connor was kind of surprising to some extent, because I'm not a lifelong Sinéad O'Connor fan. Like many people, I really knew three things about Sinéad O'Connor. I knew that her hair was shaved. I knew that in 1990, she had a mega hit with the Prince penned song, Nothing Compares to You. And I knew that 2 years later, she appeared on Saturday Night Live, where she tore up a photograph of Pope John Paul II, which ultimately derailed her career. So I was actually working on an entirely different story. And as sometimes happens when you're on YouTube and you see your search results, off to the side are usually some other videos. Hopefully that's not happening now if you're watching on YouTube. But in this case, my curiosity led me to some videos about Sinéad O'Connor. And I started to wonder what really happened to her. How did she go so quickly from being a superstar to being a scandal? And to me, that was really the beginning of a journey that I've been on now. This started maybe January 2021. So the first thing was realizing that what happened that night on Saturday Night Live when she tore the photograph of the Pope, that she was trying to draw attention to the child abuse scandal in the Catholic Church. And we all know now that she was sounding the alarm about something that was in fact happening. Now, Sinéad was not a victim of clergy abuse, but the connection for her was that she grew up in a family where she was a survivor of childhood abuse at the hands of her devoutly religious mother. And the photograph, it turns out, was from the Pope's visit to Ireland in 1979. It was her mother's prized possession. And after her mother died in a car crash when Sinéad was a teenager, shortly before she signed her first record contract, Sinéad kept that photograph. And for her, it was a symbol of the church's complicity in really silencing survivors. And so it really all kind of came together, but nobody knew that at the time. So she tore the photograph up, and it was a scandal that many say derailed her career. Many years later, she would say re-railed her career, because it put her onto the path that she wanted to do, which is to be an artist rather than a pop star. But what interested me is what happened after that. And so we'll get to talk about that a little bit this evening, but that's really to sort of set up that there was a lot more to it than we knew at the time. And that was the beginning of my interest in revisiting that part of Sinead's career and everything else that came after. Now I would like to introduce my co-presenter this evening, Kimberly Mack. And she'll be talking about Time's Up, which is a band that really broke in the late 80s, right around the same time as Sinead. And in some ways, you know, they became superstars in the pop world, but also challenged a lot of the pop world's conventions at that time.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I came to my subject in a slightly different way. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York in the 1970s as a young Black girl loving rock music. And I don't know how controversial that is now, but certainly in the 70s, that was unusual. My mother was somebody who was a baby boomer, born in 46, loved rock and roll, stuck around for rock in the 1970s. I didn't have a siblings, so she was like my road to rock. And, you know, we just enjoyed this music together. But as I read her magazines, she would have Rolling Stone and Cream and Trouser Press and Relics hanging around the house. And as I eventually got a little older and started going to rock shows, I just noticed that everyone that was a part of the scene seemed to be white. And I sincerely believed that rock was white, that I was invited to enjoy it as a fan, but that it really wasn't for me, that it really wasn't part of my own culture, that I was an interloper. And, you know, my mom would play Jimi Hendrix, she would play Thin Lizzy, who of course had Phil Lynott as the lead singer and songwriter. She would talk about love, but she never really talked to me about the origins of rock, and that rock came out of rock and roll. And of course, rock and roll, you know, had a Black face with Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Laverne Baker and others leading the way. So I grew up just not understanding. I also came of age as hip hop became popular. And there was a wonderful moment in the mid 80s when I heard Rock Box by Run DMC for the first time. And so I did have this opportunity to see this moment with Black folks in the space of rock music. Eddie Martinez was a guitarist, you know, a man of color playing rock guitar. And that opened up a little tiny crack and made me wonder and made me, you know, somewhat optimistic that maybe there was a place for me, but that was somewhat short-lived. And so it was really Living Color that came along in the late 80s when I was 19, who really changed all of that for me. This was a band of 4 young Black men who rocked hard and who also had something to say. You know, their lyrics were not what was normative at that time for rock lyrics, for the most part, certainly in the hard rock genre or metal genre. And it was their second record, Time's Up, that really kind of turned the light switch on for me, not just about Black folks having a space in rock, but as Black folks being the originators of rock. They're part of their I don't know, I don't want to say mission, but certainly part of what they accomplished when they came on the scene was this reclamation of rock as Black. I mean, they did that in addition to being a fantastic band with great lyrics and great music. And for me, when I heard the second record, Time's Up, and I saw them on Arsenio, not Arsenio, on Showtime at the Apollo, and they played the song Pride, all of that kind of came together for me. Their song Pride has the lyrics, "Don't ask me why I play this music, because it's my culture, so naturally I use it." That just was, I can't really overstate how important that was for me, because I didn't know that it was my music. So this band, in addition to, again, being just, you know, amazing musicians and having really incredible songs, they also had lyrics that helped a young me recognize my own inheritance, and that rock was part of my own cultural inheritance. So for me, when I decided that I wanted to write a 33 and a third book, and I wanted to write one on Living Color, I knew it was going to be the second record. I also grew up in a home that was violent. And when I heard the first song, Time's Up, that also gave me an outlet for some of that anger. So it was very, very clear to me that Time's Up was going to be the record. And it also felt important to me, just to say very quickly, what the book has is it has their voice. It was really, really important to me to have a lot of different perspectives in my book. So, it has a mix of biography, oral history, memoir, cultural criticism, etc. It has critics' voices. It has my own personal voice, but it also has the voice of the band. And I thought that was particularly important given the time frame that they came out in, when this notion of Black people playing rock was controversial. And they had a lot to overcome to have the success they had. So it was really important to me to have their voices in there. So that's what set me on the path to write this book. And I'll be happy to talk more about it with all of you.
So Rachel, we were talking about basically that Kim and I are roughly the same age. Our parents are roughly the same age. We grew up kind of, even though I was in Philadelphia and she was in Brooklyn, really growing up in, I think to kind of contextualize this, in monoculture, where music came to us by way of the radio or a little bit later by MTV. But the way that you found out about what was happening was really kind of filtered through those perceptions and that of the music press at that time. And that is where a lot of these perceptions came from about, white versus Black music.
Yeah, something that really interests me about your book is you both brought your personal stories into the book and sort of talked about how you were attracted to rock music through like a rebellion of youth, like you were feeling rebellious in your youth, and something about the rock music pulled you in. And for you particularly, Allyson, Sinead O'Connor, because she had a shaved head, she was a woman, she was kind of saying controversial things. And for you, Kimberly, because Living Color was an all Black band, and that was really sort of like an anomaly back then. And something I was thinking about was, as rock journalists and writers and also fans of the music, as you started to do more research and getting more into like the rock world, how did you reconcile sort of this idea that rock music, it says it's rebellious, and it's for the outsider, but so much of the industry pushes the outsider out? So I was just curious how either of you deal with that. I mean, even now and even back then, in continuing to understand your identity as a listener and a journalist.
Kim, would you like to take that first?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's one that I had when I just did a book tour, and I had someone ask me something kind of like that, but I guess for me, when I was growing up, I didn't really recognize that. I was so caught up, I think, in feeling like an outsider and believing I was an outsider that I wasn't even really questioning very much the whole structure. I didn't really question the structure until way later. So for me, it was all about trying to feel a sense of belonging as a child, and trying to make sense of why it was this particular music and the scene around the music. So not just the music, but also the infrastructure, the radio, the magazines, the live shows. Why was it that I could be so invested in something that didn't seem to really care if I was there or not, you know. So there was that. And then later, when I got older, and again, I can't overstate, this may seem unusual, or I don't know, maybe it doesn't seem unusual. Maybe there are other people out there who can relate to this, but I really can't overstate how much this one band for me really opened up my eyes. Because they were a political band. I talk about it in the book, and you get a sense, I think, of who they are through their biographies and their backgrounds. And they were all coming from pretty politically conscious and, for the most part, Afrocentric homes. And I didn't really grow up in an Afrocentric home. I didn't grow up in a self-hating home. I don't want that to come across wrong. I didn't grow up in a home that wasn't proudly Black, but I didn't grow up in a home that was really focused on kind of an Afro-diasporic sense, or really digging in deep to kind of all of the kind of historical and cultural contributions that Black people had made. I just didn't grow up in that kind of a home. So this band coming along with these lyrics that were really delving into not just what's going on in the present day, although they were talking about things that were important in the present day, but were really giving a nice cultural and historical context to what it means to be Black, did a lot for me. So I would say that Living Coulour was the band, and Time's Up specifically was the record. It's a very, very Black record. Vernon Reid calls it the blackest record that Living Coulour made. That was what really did, I think, push me more towards starting to think about this structure, right? And how is it and why is it that Black people have been erased from rock, not rock and roll as much, but rock. So that was a little bit later. So I wasn't really thinking about it as much as when I was a kid, but later as an adult, I started to think about it more. And you're absolutely right. It doesn't make sense to view a style, a category. I'm shying away from the word genre on purpose, and maybe if there's time later, I'll explain why, of music as rebellious and then be so, exclusive and exclude so many people. But yeah, it took me kind of growing up to start to grapple with that.
Yeah, thank you.
And I would have to say, just to be clear, I wasn't really aware of Sinéad O'Connor as a young person. Like, I wasn't really seeing her as being rebellious or an outsider or having all this stuff. I think initially she failed to land for me because really she came onto my radar about the time when Nothing Compares to You came out. That's 90. And I mistook her for a pop star. It wasn't really until later that I went back and saw her catalog and understood really what she was doing. To build on what Kim was saying also, like Philadelphia, where I grew up, is known as a huge rock and roll city. And one of the local radio stations every year would have a parade called the Louie Louie Parade. And everybody would show up, thousands of people in the streets with kazoos, all doing Louie Louie. And very few of them, I think, knew the history of that song, knew that it was a song written by a Black artist. I think that, the Black architects of rock were completely erased on the rock and roll radio stations that I listened to. You would think that it was like Elvis, the Beatles, and the Stones, the Holy Trinity. No one talked about, Otis Blackwell or Arthur Crudup or Laverne Baker, Willie Mae, Big Mama Thornton, any Little Richard, really, those were not on the radio. And that same excuse, I think, was used by MTV in the early years to talk about why they didn't play back Black artists, because they were saying our format is rock. A lot of people have talked about, for example, they didn't play rap or hip hop artists, but it wasn't just rap or hip hop artists. It was also Whitney Houston had a hard time getting her videos played on MTV early on because it was said that she didn't fit the rock format. So I think this is a kind of racial segregation that was built into our experience. our listening experience, our viewing experience, the way that these artists were covered or not covered or talked about. And so I think a little bit the idea that there was this sort of rebellious thing happening in music was part of a kind of a formation. I'm using kind of a fancy word here, but let's say I'll use a less fancy word, an image. It was an image that was racialized, genderized. It had to do with sexual orientation, who could rock and who could not rock was something that you heard all the time. So when I was coming up, I thought, Bowie, The Clash, these were people who I didn't say, oh, I could be just like that if not for being a woman. I was just like, I'm going to be just like that.
Right.
Similarly, Sinead O'Connor, she saw herself as a protest singer. Her idols were Bob Dylan, John Lennon, Bob Marley. It really wasn't until she, was in the music industry herself where she started to get some resistance to the idea of being that kind of artist. And I think what you saw with the shaved hair initially and the ripped up jeans and all of that was trying to refocus the attention on her as an artist and not as a pop teen queen.
Right. Yeah. Something that also struck me in both of your books was that the bands, or Sinead and Living Coulour, were so aware of how the audience was perceiving them. I don't think that's a normal thing with artists. I know obviously you have to think about who you're playing to and you have to market yourself to the people you're playing to, but I feel like it is a thing of not coming from a place of privilege necessarily, that you have to be like, well, we're Black rock musicians, like we really have to think about how we're coming across. Which, like, if I listen to a interview of David Bowie, he's saying never stray from your vision, do exactly what you want to do all the time. And so I was just hyper aware that, these musicians didn't necessarily, they couldn't just live in that utopia of I'm just going to do whatever I want to do and it's not going to have any consequences. Their identity was very much ingrained into the music. Would you say that was true?
Do you want to go first, Allyson?
Well, I think especially the early music, Sinead's early music, really a lot of it was a sort of memoir in progress, because, a lot of the songs she wrote on the first two albums, she wrote when she was a teen, she was really young. But even early on, she is really just thinking about how can she use her voice as a platform for others, to talk about things that were happening in her life, but also things that were happening societally. And I think what you see over and over and over again, she's thinking of herself as in the mold of these other artists, but when she tries to do it, like, she wants to talk about child abuse, she wants to talk about racism, she wants to talk about the commercial focus of the music industry, she wants to talk about HIV/AIDS prevention, she wants to talk about so many issues, but people don't want, the people who are interviewing her want to talk to her about how she used to be a kissogram girl when she was in her teens in Ireland. I mean, they don't want her to go there. So they keep trying to sort of steer her back. I think in her case, she really didn't care. I think she sort of always knew, probably, that there was going to be a limited amount of time that she was going to be able to have that platform. And every opportunity that she had, she used it, to try to make a statement that was political, but also sincere to the things that she cared about and the kind of change that she wanted to affect in the world. And after SNL, she said it derailed rather than derailed her career, because what a lot of people don't know is that she continued and continues to this day, to make music in all different genres, also filtered through her own sensibilities. So long after she stopped making sort of quote unquote pop hits, she was still making music. And with Living Coulour, they're still together. They're still making music. So I think that there's this idea about thinking about, shaping your image or crafting it. And, it's sort of different at the time when you're thinking about the beginning of a career and trying to get established. You're depending on labels and you're depending on other gatekeepers, versus being an artist and making the kind of music that you want to make and hoping that that music reaches an audience.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I don't think that the focus, the spotlight on Living Coulour affected their artistry. Like, I don't think it affected the music. I don't think it affected what they were hoping to do with their music, if anything. particularly with the second record, they really made the record they wanted to make. And it didn't end up having the same commercial life that the first record did. And they really followed their own path with that. But I do think that given that they were a Black rock band, it was really everyone else on the outside, all of the external forces who would not let them forget that they were a Black rock band. And, and of course, writers don't write their headlines for the most part, but, there were so many headlines that were all focused on Living Color, their skin color, and the fact that they played rock. There would be these, funny little puns, and people were just so laser focused on that for the first record, and also for the second record. It started to die down a little bit, slightly for the second record, but pretty much that remained the focus. And so they did have to really consistently in the media grapple with these labels, limitations that others would put on them, the same questions over and over again about why. Again, part of the lyric for Pride is, "Don't ask me why I play this music," which was coming out of a direct experience. Will Calhoun, the drummer, wrote the song. But I've said this before, and I'll say it again because I think it's worth saying over and over again, as tedious as that must have been for the band, I really can't think of a better band to have been in that position, because these are really incredibly intelligent, and also really, for people whose backgrounds I think really prepared them to have those conversations, to feel confident having those conversations, to have those conversations grounded in a real education versus just sort of hot takes or knee-jerk reactions to being irritated. As successful as Living Color was at the end of the 80s and at the very beginning of the 90s, that was a really horrible time for Black people in the United States, and particularly in New York City. It was really dark, for so many reasons. And so while they were having some success, I think it was imperative, and they knew this, that they use their platform to shine a light, right, on these things, whether it was police brutality, whether it was, of course, racism, classism, gentrification, which in New York City was beginning, and it was in its beginning stages. And of course, that project is almost finished, and New York City is unrecognizable from the New York City that I lived in. And all kinds of other issues that they knew were really important. So yeah, this was a band that I think we all needed at that time. This is a band who continues to be very, very important in terms of their ability to, again, have that 1-2 punch of making like listenable, really exciting music while also having lyrics and a message that's important at the same time. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think something you both talked about too in your book was, like you just said, Kimberly, like so much of their music didn't evolve to some people past this is an all Black band. So people don't even listen. They're just like fixed on this one thing. And with Sinead, like she's crazy. I mean, I was telling Allyson, like I grew up a huge Fiona Apple fan, but Sinead was a little before my time. But I remember growing up in 2012, like being a teenager and stuff, and seeing all the headlines like Sinead fights with Miley and all of these I'd scroll Facebook and see all this stuff, and it colored my view of this person without even listening to their music. And I think the casual fan doesn't know that so much of music PR and like marketing and artist relies on getting this story about the artist and distilling it, and you keep telling that story. And even as an artist, the label coaches you of like, you're telling this story. and this is the story you're telling.
Mhm.
And, you know, it can be very reductive to a person's music and to a person's, you know, image as an artist. It also can have the ability to send the artist out into the world, and the message can reach so many people because it's a simple message that people can grasp. And I just wanted to know if there's anything as rock journalists and writers that you do or you make sure to do to paint the artist as a human being, and to show another side. That is, you know, and if you've gotten in trouble for doing that by any, you know what I mean? Like, is that allowed? Can you do that?
Well, I mean, there's this sort of PR person, but I mean, a lot of what we're talking about, I think really didn't come so much from the PR person in that era as it did from the DJs and the rock journalists, you know, and the programmers at MTV and the broader culture, you know. So like a week after Sinead tears the photograph of the Pope, Joe Pesci is hosting Saturday Night Live. And during his monologue, you know, he's saying, oh, you know, I was so offended. And if I had been hosting that evening, and why I would have gave her such a smack, you know, he said, I would have grabbed her by and the thing he says next is eyebrows. Of course, now we can read it through a different lens post-Trump and imagine a different word, but the idea was the same, right? I would have grabbed her by and the audience is laughing and cheering. And so the point wasn't just that Pesci was a misogynist. It was like that those ideas landed with the audience because that's what they were thinking and feeling. And there are multiple times in the book where I give you really concrete examples of journalists who portrayed Sinead as crazy in all kinds of ways. And, you know, I think as a young person reading that, I probably would have just been like, yeah, she's crazy. You know, I wasn't critically thinking about it. But now as a professional journalist, I can go back and I can go like, okay, so they were also shaping this kind of narrative and it was serving certain kinds of needs. And it landed because the audience already had that kind of, they're primed for it, right? And I would say the same thing about if I read at that time, oh, wow, Living Color, they're rockers, but they're Black. Wow, that's kind of novel. I wouldn't necessarily put together because I wouldn't have the background knowledge and information. I would have been ignorant to the idea that really rock and roll, like all forms of popular music, is at its base Black music. And that's not said enough. I think even today, I don't think that's said enough. And so I feel a little bit like partially what I try to do as a journalist is not just take at face value, either something that's given to me by the PR people, certainly, but even in research, like what else has been said or written about this band, this artist, and go back and try to figure out like, where did that idea come from and test that idea. And is that right? Or are there other facts that paint a different picture? So with Sinead, maybe there is no separating Sinead's legacy from that moment on SNL, but there is the opportunity to recontextualize it and reframe it. And I think in doing so, I'm not just having us think differently about Sinead, but hopefully also having us think differently about the culture and ourselves in relationship to that culture.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to co-sign everything that Allyson just said. And then also just add that I feel like personally, when I'm interviewing, whether I'm interviewing someone as a journalist or whether I'm interviewing somebody as a cultural studies or popular music studies scholar, I just feel like I need to get out of the way. You know, I really do. I'm one of those interviewers who kind of lets people talk. Sometimes it's to my own detriment because I end up with very long interviews. But I feel like that I have to transcribe later. But I feel like actually, when you let people talk, at some point, you really do. You get the nuggets, you get the kernel, you get the real truth in there at some point. And so I like to let people go, but I try to stay out of the way. And I recognize very much that we are all shapers of our images, you know, that we are all in this process when we are talking about ourselves, talking about our lives, you know, we are, you know, we're telling our truths for the most part, but they're subjective truths. You know, I understand all of that, but I still feel like it's important for artists to have the chance to do that, to share their voices and sometimes share their subjective truths, because I still feel like in there's an important kernel. My whole first book was about this, actually, but I feel like there's an important kernel of honesty that comes through in even when people are being kind of or advancing kind of autobiographical fictions. You know, I still think that there's something very important in there that we learn about people. So my whole philosophy is to stay out of the way and let people talk and hear what they have to say and figure out what the story is from there. And of course, having spent time as a music historian and having read a lot of things and understanding, you know, sort of cultural context for music, popular music history, that helps also to have a sense of kind of where these ideas are coming from, and as Allyson puts it, why certain reactions, whether it's a press reaction or something in popular culture, lands or doesn't land a certain way. But yeah, bottom line, I just like to let people speak for themselves.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we got some questions from the audience. First question is, how would you describe the critical reception of Sinéad O'Connor and Living Coulour in the late 80s? Did critics have an appreciation or a rejection of these artists, or push against the grain to lead popular tastes? And whoever wants to take this one.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think, you know, there were some positive reviews of Sinéad O'Connor's early albums, but, you know, by the time she gets to the third album, which is before SNL, it's a collection of show tunes and standards. You know, it's not aiming to be a commercial pop album. So I think that there was some pushback even on that. But like most of the pushback on Sinéad had to do not with the music specifically, but the public statements that she made, the activism of Sinéad. So as I mentioned in the beginning, you know, she didn't want people to look at her. That's why she dressed the way that she did. That's why she cut her hair the way that she did. But, you know, she was a little bit shy and sometimes awkward in interviews. And so, you know, people would go to these same questions. I heard you were a kissogram girl, you know, when you were a teenager, and let's talk about that. Or why is your haircut so strange? You know, that kind of thing. The real shift happens in '89. She's going to be on the '89 Grammys. And she's up for her first nomination for Best Female Rock Vocal Performance. And the Grammys, that would be her first appearance on primetime US TV. She'd been on David Letterman, but this was primetime. And back then, everybody was watching the Grammys. The problem is, '89, the Grammys are finally giving an award for rap, but they've decided that they will not televise that award, that they say they don't have enough time. So they're going to present it off camera. And as a result, some of the nominees decided to boycott the ceremony. She decided to come to the ceremony, but she came with Public Enemy's logo dyed into the side of her hair. And that was a way of saying these artists will not be erased from the program. They'll be present in some way. So that began a kind of first moment where people were introduced to Sinéad, and also introduced to Sinéad in a controversial way. You know, I think what happens in '90, when the album comes out, the album is called I Do Not Want What I Haven't Got. It's the album with Nothing Compares to You. It's hugely successful, but there's an earlier appearance on '90 she's supposed to do on Saturday Night Live, and she pulls out of it because she hears that the comedian Andrew Dice Clay is going to perform, and she objects to the misogyny and homophobia in his comedy. And so she's widely accused of censorship. Also in 1990, she's supposed to do a show at the Garden State Arts Center in New Jersey. And apparently it's the custom, or was at that time, for the national anthem to be played before an artist came on. So there's a couple different versions of the story floating around, but what it amounts to is she was asked by two people who are posing as reporters how she felt about that. She didn't really want the national anthem to be played. She didn't think that really had to do with what she was doing there as an Irish artist performing. And so it came to the local station as she refuses to play and she's anti-American. Again, accused of censorship. So, you know, those are just three examples. But I think when people are responding negatively, it's like she's moving out of the pop lane and she's making these statements that are construed to be political. And that's really a problem for her and the way that she's perceived. So that SNL isn't the first straw. It's really like there's been a series of straws up until that point.
That's really interesting. and as you were talking, I was thinking about Living Color, and they were so part of their brand, as we would put it now, was kind of speaking to all of these issues that they cared about, all of these what we would call now social justice issues that they cared about. And they actually weren't pushed, they didn't get the pushback. So I wonder how much of that was gendered actually, but they didn't get the pushback for that. But what did happen with Living Color is just simply that reporters wouldn't stop going on about it. Like it was just such a constant thing. I read everything I could find that was written about Vivid and also Time's Up. And for Vivid, again, it was all about they're Black, they play rock. Oh my goodness. You had some writers who would say, who would have to kind of, rehearse this thing of like, oh, this is actually pretty absurd, that this is a big deal because of course, rock music came out of rock and roll, which is Black. You had some, but then they would go on to then talk about it. It's like they had the directive where they had to talk about it. But some of them would, first have the little disclaimer in the beginning. But pretty much it was all, yeah, they're Black, they play rock, this is so amazing. Oh, and then you had some stuff that ended up in the book where, there was a writer in the UK who actually was just kind of like, like, okay, yeah, they've got this, this political stance, and, it's even in their name, it kind of suggests, their color and what they're doing. And, they have the manifesto under their arm, but can they rock, kind of thing. So there was, like a questioning of whether they were more of a, like a political project, right? Some people even would say with that first record, there are a couple of writers who would say, yeah, their message and, where they're kind of leading the cultural conversation. I'm paraphrasing, but where they're leading the cultural conversation, A+, but their music is not as good. Like that was like the first record. Time's Up was different. That record, I think, I struggled to find a bad review for that record. That record was pretty much universally critically acclaimed. That record was praised pretty much everywhere. They won a second Grammy, they, they really, the media, I think, just had no choice but to focus on the music with that record, but they also continued to bring in race. But in terms of their conversations around all of the issues and concerns and social concerns that they had, no one really pushed back on that with them. I think people kind of, if anything, would try to get them to talk about those things. So as I said, listening here, I now am rethinking how much of that maybe did have to do with gender. I don't know.
Also, when they come together, I'm thinking about, Vivid, they win a Grammy for that. And that by that point, Sinead O'Connor's up, but she's going to boycott the Grammys and all awards, actually. She's decided it's just commercialism and she's not interested. But actually, she gets represented because Vernon Reid wears a T-shirt with Sinead O'Connor, her face on it. And then when he was asked about it, he told the press, look, the recording industry doesn't tell me what to wear, which was brilliant.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this was a band that, again, Living Color were not at all afraid to talk about stuff. I think what ended up happening, and Rachel, you kind of alluded to this earlier, I think what happened with them was, the first record, tremendously successful, millions of copies sold, MTV Awards, Grammy Award, a whole bunch of fans opening up for the Stones, all this stuff. Second record, Momentum, right? This band single-handedly desegregated rock radio. This band, just did a lot of things that I don't know that they still get enough credit for now. Second record, a lot of momentum. So automatically the first single Type went to rock radio, played on MTV, all of this stuff. But the sales, they sold a lot, like in the first month or so. I believe they sold about 500,000 copies, which was very quick, but then it stalled out. And I think it was a combination of a bunch of things. I think part of it was their kind of speaking out on such a consistent level, even though, in some ways you could look at it as the press kind of like provoking them into that at times. But I think for some people, they were probably seen as a bit of a message band at that point. And then also their second record was a little less, I think, easily digestible. Their first record, I think, was really legible to a hard rock and metal loving audience. And I think their second record is more experimental. They moved between all these different genres. I hate that word. Categories of music. And quickly, I don't like the word because genres are not real and they're fictions and they're all about marketing categories. Anyway, they move between all these different categories of music, sometimes in the same song. And, and I think as a Black band, they were punished, as a Black rock band, punished for doing the kinds of things that white rock bands didn't get punished for, and delegitimized, their rock legitimacy was questioned because they would have, someone like Queen Latifah on the record. So yeah, I do think that, they absolutely, faced a lot of different, challenges of being a Black rock band, even though they were men.
And if you had a hit record, like especially, in that era, if you had a hit record, there was such enormous pressure on you for your next record to be an even bigger hit, that there was so much sort of engineering of that happening for most artists. Like, no, we got to replicate exactly the thing that you did, because that worked. In fact, there's 5 other bands trying to do that now. So for any artist who wasn't doing that, it was really risky, commercially speaking.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Corey Glover talks about it in the book. He a moment that was very candid. And one of those moments I talk about, like just kind of standing out of the way, and he said that he felt like that second record maybe wasn't the right second record. Maybe that was a third or fourth record, because it was a record. And of course, Vernon talked about it being the Blackest record they ever made. And so I think all of those things coming together did, I think, help to derail the the kind of commercial success momentum that they had.
Thank you. So we got another question to bring up the inevitable topic of Prince. Could you both comment on Prince as a pop star maker for Sinead O'Connor? He did that for a lot of other artists. What do you think of the Prince-Sinead O'Connor collaboration for her second album and for Prince?
Okay, I'll start by saying there was no collaboration between Prince and Sinead O'Connor. Nothing Compares to You, was not a major hit in his repertoire at the time. She covered it. It was a suggestion by her manager at that time for her to cover this song, which was not a major hit for Prince. And it was a business transaction. So I think that because Prince played such a really big role in a lot of artists' careers, people assumed that that was true for Sinead also. So I think that that's often repeated, but it really actually just isn't true. They didn't meet until that song was already a big hit for her in '90. So I think that's the first part of it. I would say that the situation between Prince and Sinead O'Connor is very, very, very complicated. When she wrote her memoir in 2021, she accused Prince of assaulting her. It wasn't the first time that she had brought that up. Actually, periodically, she's brought that up throughout, since the 90s. Off and on, it's come up, but for a lot of people, it was the first time they heard it when her memoir came out. And since it was sort of a juicy bit, it got picked up by the media and amplified. Did it happen? We don't know. I mean, none of us can actually say. I think that for me, the more interesting question, rather than trying to figure out something that is beyond my ability to litigate, was really trying to understand how people responded to the accusation. Because, Prince is a creative genius and he lifted up so many people, including a lot of women. It's really hard to square that with the allegation of assault. It's also really hard to think about this in the context of many, many false accusations of assault against Black men. They were not true. So there's that history as well, a terrible history of that. At the same time, I think that there's this idea that you mentioned at the top of our conversation, which is like, Sinead is crazy, and ergo everything she ever says is crazy, and there's no way that it could be true. I think when you pit racism against misogyny, like, no one wins. You know, so from my point of view, I just really wanted to kind of get to the idea of how do we understand how people have responded to the allegation of assault, rather than trying to kind of sort out whether or not the assault actually occurred, which nobody can really say except for, you know, potentially Sinead and Prince. And obviously Prince can't talk. He's no longer with us. But, you know, I do want to say, though, just to clarify, you know, again, that she was not his protege in any way. And I think that's important to understand in terms of thinking about their relationship as creators. Kim, do you want to? I'm passionate about this.
Yeah, I don't know, Kimberly, if you have anything to say about this.
But. No, I don't really have anything to say about Prince and Sinead. I do have something else to say, though, about Sinead and Living Color, because there is overlap. I mean, there's overlap, you know, Allyson's book and my book, of course, look at artists who both had their, you know, the pinnacle of their commercial success at the same time. And, you know, as Allyson put it, became superstars, became pop stars when really they were artists, and then had to kind of figure out how to square that. But also, there was a moment in the book that I talk about where I had a chance to interview Corey Glover, who's the lead singer for Living Color. I had a chance to interview his vocal coach, and he had a lot of great stories. And one of the stories was for the song Solace of You, which was about Corey's dad, who passed away just before they hit really big with Living Color. And he had performed a version of the song, and it was fine. Like, as the vocal coach says, you know, it was fine, but it wasn't what it could be. And actually, he was trying to explain it, but he wasn't quite getting it across. And then they were watching MTV happened to be on, and Sinead O'Connor happened to be on with Nothing Compares to You. And the way he explained it was singers do this thing sometimes where it's like a megaphone and everything is like a spray and everything's going out. And then sometimes it's like a hug, right? And they're giving you a nice warm hug. And that's what he saw Sinead O'Connor doing with her vocals in that moment. Full close up, you know, the tear dropping, but like a vocal hug, right? And that was what he used to kind of as a model for Corey. And then Corey got it. It clicked. He went in on one take, did the song, and had to hold it back and not lose it himself and not cry. And then it's a song to this day that's, you know, one of people's favorite songs and most requested songs in the Living Color live show. So that's another point of connection.
Yeah, I mean, the tear was, she was thinking about her mother, you know, and that's, the tear wasn't like acting. I mean, that's really what happened at the moment that the video was shot. I mean, I guess I just sort of feel like if we think of like, oh, Prince is a flawless deity and Sinead is a flawed psycho, we deny both of their humanity. You know, we deny the humanity for each of them. But I think if we could recognize their humanity, that's the key to recognizing our own humanity. You know, that the idea is that we all have a right, I think, in some way to be imperfect. I mean, I think that's kind of the condition of being a human. And I think if we can get that, I think our society will be in a much better place.
So we're sort of running out of time here, but I just wanted to get to this last question from the audience, mainly directed for Allyson. It says, after recently watching the documentary about Sinead, I was very moved and rather sad by her struggles and how she was scapegoated. Allyson, so glad you've written this. Did you get to talk to her, and can you say something of how she feels emotionally about all that has happened to her?
I did get to talk to her. When her memoir came out, I did a profile of Sinead for NPR. And, that was really, when we do our stories on NPR, we'll get like somewhere between 5 and 7 minutes typically. So it's like, I kind of think of what I'm doing is creating an audio trailer for a movie I'd really like you to see, So, but I did interview her, and that kind of informed the way that I approached the book. I didn't continue to interview her as I was writing the book because I felt that really would have changed this book. It would have been written for her rather than being written about her. And so I think she is pretty complex, and I don't try to make her out to be a saint. I also don't try to make her out to be somebody who you've seen in the media narratives. So how does she feel about it? I mean, I think that she's kind of generally pretty reluctant to talk to press because of the way that she has been treated over many, many years. And when the memoir came out, her memoir in 2021, people kept coming back to SNL and continuously asking her if she owes anyone an apology, sidestepping totally the question of whether anyone owes an apology to her. So I think it's been difficult, but I will say I'm really heartened that she is, she's still around. She's still making music. She did the theme music for Outlander that's recently come out. And after hiatus, she's back on social media. So, knock on wood, I think we'll hear more from her. I think that my hope is that the documentary that you mentioned and my book and conversations like this one will, help us to see her in a new light as an artist, but also as a human, and that we'll continue to be able to enjoy her music. It's out there in the world. There's, like I said, many, many albums of all different kinds of music and music that she's still making now. So if we can stop kind of being fixated on the tabloid stuff and more focused on the music, I think that, we'll really be able to enjoy that. Also,
Well,
Living Coulour is still making music too, right? I mean, they're doing a big thing right now. So maybe before we break, we could talk a little bit about what they're up to.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're on a massive tour. Like it's funny because I have been in touch with them, but I wasn't aware of I knew they were going to have some dates because it's the 30th anniversary. Yeah, right now it's the 30th anniversary of Stain, their third record, and I thought it was just going to be kind of a small thing, but no, they are on an international tour. And they're playing with Extreme some dates. They're headlining lots of dates on their own here and in the UK, Australia, different places. So yeah, and I know they're working on a record too. So yeah, and they are very much.
When I read Kim's book, I went back and I listened to Time's Up, and it's so fresh. Like, it doesn't feel like something that was made in 1990. It feels just as fresh today as it did then.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm probably somewhat biased given that I wrote a whole book about it, but I wholeheartedly agree. I don't know how many times I listened to that record, but I never get tired of it. Every time I listen to it, it's like, oh, I'm hearing it for the first time again. Sounds like a cliche, but it's really honestly true.
So I'm saying we should, our advice, I think collectively, is go ahead and listen to I Do Not Want What I Haven't Got and Time's Up. Listen to them together and you get a good sense of, what 1990 might have been like.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And thank you so much, Allyson McCabe and Kimberly Mack, for joining us tonight, and for everyone who tuned in. Go buy their books on go buy their books on malaprops.com. You can find them on the event page. And yeah, so we have this. Allyson, you take it away.
Yeah, I just want to say, I have one more thing I want to talk about just for a tiny bit. A fantastic musician and collage artist from Philadelphia area called Joe Castro, also known as the Mighty Joe Castro.
You might want to hit your phone for a second too.
Am I? Oh yes, sorry.
Yeah,
Here we go.
Mm-hmm.
There we go. He made this gorgeous print. It's called Truthful Witness. It was inspired by the book, and we are going to be giving a copy of that away to one of you people who are attending tonight's event. They're out there. So I'll let Rachel talk about the logistics, but Joe would be happy to give one print away to a person who, the only requirement is that we want to know about what is your favorite Sinead O'Connor song that is not Nothing Compares to You, and just tell us a little bit why, and we'll make sure offline to get your private information and send you out a print.
Yeah, so you can just email that response to virtualqa@malaprops.com, and we will pick somebody and send you the print. And thank you so much. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope everyone has a great Tuesday night. And thank you to our authors again.
Thank you.
Thank you.